I just want to start off by telling you this about this case. And it's first in your jury instructions when you go back to review them. They're going to tell you don't guess. You're not supposed to make guesses about what happened in this case, and you're not even supposed to solve the mystery or discover all of the facts that were left out of this case. Don't guess. We have this very high standard in criminal cases. The standard here is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Not is this questionable, not is this suspicious, not even is this likely, not even is this really darned likely. The standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm going to come back to that standard, but we have that standard for a reason. This is the most serious type of courtroom that we ever get in any kind of case in this country, is a criminal case. And for the most serious type of courtroom, we have the most serious standard of proof. And it's your job as jurors to hold the government to that standard of proof. We don't guess when we're dealing with criminal law. We don't guess when we're dealing with criminal charges. So please don't guess. I'm going to ask you to assess the facts of this case. We have two competing versions of events in this case. We have the state's idea, and the state says that Mr. Kelly walks out of his house one day with no provocation whatsoever. He takes aim at a great distance at people who are unarmed on his property, and he fires shots intending to hit those people. That's their version of events. Mr. Kelly and his wife tell something very, very different. And I'm going to talk about what they say happened here, but I want you to ask yourselves while I'm going through that, is what Mr. Kelly and his wife says consistent with the facts, the known facts of this case, the known evidence that has been presented to you? Not, is this consistent with somebody's subjective interpretation of somebody else's words? Those aren't facts, those are guesses. I want to ask you if what Mr. Kelly said happened is consistent with the facts. And it is. The evidence has showed that Mr. Kelly comes from Montana with his wife, and they eventually settle here, and they begin ranching. The evidence showed you in this case that they had a long time on this ranch before anything, happened. They've been here for decades. They are locals at this point. We heard from Wanda about the increased activity that took place on their property that we talked about in the opening statement. Wanda testified to that. You heard from Mr. Kelly about different instances where he was shot at. When he was interviewed by Detective Ainsa, he described those instances. We heard from Gary Wisdom, one of Mr. Kelly's neighbors who's in that same area, the same thing. When he originally started ranching there, he saw small family groups and didn't feel any danger. Gary Wisdom later says, eventually I started seeing bigger groups of men carrying weapons. And he called Border Patrol to report that at times. Border Patrol came out. He has no idea if they ever caught them or not. We heard from Border Patrol that this is a high-trafficked area. There's a lot that comes through here. It's just north of that area where the wall ends. There are people who come through. There are drugs. There are vehicles. We heard from Border Patrol that it's impossible to distinguish nowadays really who's carrying drugs and who are just groups of migrants, because the drugs have gotten smaller as time has gone on. We have heard from Border Patrol that there are things that exist called rip crews. There are bandits. There are people who will rob migrant groups, who will kidnap migrants, who will steal drugs, and who will get into violent altercations with other people who are engaged in criminal activity in this area. That's not Mr. Kelly's imagination. That's what you heard from Border Patrol, who are out there every day on the ground dealing with what goes on out there. Border Patrol also talked about how there are a lot of unknowns. We know the cameras are not that effective. We know people know where to avoid detection. They know how to avoid detection. They know where our cameras are. So there's a lot that goes on that goes unseen and unknown by Border Patrol. They see signs of it, they know it's out there, but they're not able to respond, and they're not able to make apprehensions all the time. And this is what's going on in Mr. Kelly's life during the lead up to this incident on January 30th. The state talks about text messages that Mr. Kelly sends between himself and his friend, Gary Miller, a very close friend who he's known for a very long time. This is somebody who Mr. Kelly trusts and who understands where Mr. Kelly's coming from. Those messages come in that context. Those messages also come in the context of Mr. Kelly receiving continuously information from Jeremy Morcell, the Border Patrol Ranch Liaison. Jeremy Morcell is continuously communicating with Mr. Kelly about large groups on his property. They're nearby. Be careful. We're working a group of this size. It's in your area. It might come your way. They might be carrying narcotics. Narcotics trafficking has picked up around Keno Springs. This is the communication that Mr. Kelly is receiving on a regular basis from Border Patrol. Border Patrol knows what they're talking about. Mr. Kelly relies on that information. The level of fear and concern that Mr. Kelly experiences on his own property is increasing as a result. He chooses to arm himself in case he ever has to defend himself. And he expresses that to his friend, Gary Miller. He talks about the fear. He talks about what's happening on his property. He does it in an over-exaggerated way to help him blow off some steam, to help him feel a little bit better, and to help assuage some of the concerns that he has, because he never knows when something is going to happen. And ultimately, something does happen on January 30th of 2023. Mr. Kelly is in his kitchen eating lunch. It's a day like any other. He's been out about on his ranch. He's planning to do some more chores for the rest of the day. He has no idea that he's about to be in a life or death situation. He doesn't ask for it. He's minding his own business in his own house. When suddenly he sees something. He sees people carrying rifles, carrying backpacks out the kitchen window. He does the right thing. He calls law enforcement. He is not some sort of vigilante who decides he's going to take matters completely into his own hands. He calls for help. He calls the guy who has the badge and the gun. He calls Jeremy Morcell. And he tells him, I hear a shot or something's shooting. I might have to return fire. Immediately, he tells law enforcement that he may have to fire. When he's walking outside, he has heard a shot. This is not a mystery shot, as the state describes. This is a real shot. Mr. Kelly hears it, and the whole situation completely changes in that moment. A gunshot outside of your home is not something you hear every day. And it's not something you hear in the same context with people running with rifles and backpacks across your property. This is a frightening, scary situation. And in frightening, scary situations, people flee, people freeze, or people act. And Mr. Kelly acted. He is being confronted on his own property, in his own house, with criminal activity involving guns in his yard. And he doesn't know what's going to happen next. He knows he needs help, so he calls Border Patrol. But he doesn't know how long it's going to take them to get there. And he doesn't know what these people are going to do in the meantime. The state would have you believe that you have to stay in your house in a situation like that. You do not. The law does not require that you stay inside of your house. In fact, that is not the smart thing to do. Mr. Kelly, when he walks outside with his rifle, his intention is to stop this threat. His intention is to make these people go away. Because if you stay inside your house, you don't know what they are going to do. They're going this direction right now, but after you lose sight of them, who knows where they're going to go? Who knows what they're going to do? This isn't a conscious thought process that Mr. Kelly went through at this time either. This was a split-second decision. He sees a threat, he responds to the threat. Mr. Kelly is the man of his house. His wife is there. He needs to protect himself, and he needs to protect his wife, just like every man should do. And he is 100% justified in walking outside to meet this threat. When he walks outside, he sees people. He sees that they are carrying rifles. He walks out onto his porch. The metal door bangs behind him. It makes a noise. The person in front looks at him and points his rifle at him. Mr. Kelly tells this to Detective Einstein. He points his rifle at me. Under those circumstances, Mr. Kelly is 100% justified in firing his weapon at that person. He doesn't need to fire warning shots. He is justified in firing at that person in that moment. Again, split-second decision. Mr. Kelly doesn't think, now I'm going to fire some warning shots in the hopes that I will have to avoid doing something else. There is no thought process. This is an immediate life or death scenario. It's an immediate decision that Mr. Kelly makes, and he chooses to not take that shot. He chooses not to fire at that person. Instead, he raises his rifle up above the tree in front of him. And you all have seen the tree. You've been to the patio. You know what this looks like. He raises it up. He fires warning shots. The state said he could have emptied this magazine. He doesn't. He stops shooting because these people start to run away. He has some more conversations with Agent Morcell about this. These folks are going somewhere. They're gone. The threat is over. He goes out to check on his barn, and he encounters Border Patrol. He has already told Agent Morcell that he was going to fire shots. As far as Mr. Kelly knows, Agent Morcell has passed on that information to everybody else who's responding. He is not required to tell every single law enforcement member every single thing that happened to him that day. He assumes that they already know because he already reported it, and that is why they're there. During this encounter, sheriff's deputies have some communication with Mr. Kelly. They have some communication with Alan, Mr. Kelly, and they start to search this area east of the house. You heard testimony from these deputies. They're searching this area east of the house. Border Patrol is traveling south. Everybody says we're looking for Mr. Kelly, and Wanda said that he went south. And yet, the sheriff's department are searching east of the house. Why are they searching east of the house? They say they're just looking for Mr. Kelly. It's because Wanda told them this is where we saw those people. And so they're searching east of the house to try to find evidence of the folks who Mr. and Mrs. Kelly described. They comb through that area. They go over the two fences. They spread out. They're looking for people. They're looking for weapons. They're looking for people who might be injured or who might be hiding. And they don't find anybody. They don't find anybody. Ultimately, they come back and they talk to Mr. Kelly and his wife. And Mr. Kelly and his wife say, this is the area where we saw people. Mr. Kelly tells them, I heard a shot. He hears a shot and he sees people running with backpacks and rifles, and law enforcement chooses not to go and look again. They don't think it's important. They don't think it's worth it to try to go see if they can find something else now that they have more information. They don't sit down with Mrs. Kelly. They don't tell her, slow down a minute, let's walk through this one step at a time. Tell me what you saw, tell me what you did, tell me where you were. They don't do that with Mr. Kelly either. They don't bother to slow down and get the information. They describe Wanda as being upset. Castañeda, Deputy Castañeda, who talked to Wanda, said she seemed upset, she seemed confused. She was distraught by what was happening. And yet, nobody took the time to ask her to take a breath, to slow down. Let's talk through this. Same thing with Mr. Kelly. He's just had this encounter. Imagine you're sitting in your kitchen and you hear a shot and you see what's happening and all this happens. Your adrenaline goes up. Your whole body is on alert when something like this happens. And when law enforcement gets there, it's still sort of coming down. It's still kind of washing out of you. Under those circumstances, people can't be expected. People who are victims of crimes, like Mr. and Mrs. Kelly were that day, they can't be expected to fully and clearly, from beginning to end, articulate to law enforcement exactly what happened. Law enforcement is trained to deal with that. Law enforcement should recognize that and talk to someone. Talk me through it slowly. That's all they had to do. Nobody did that. And now the fact that Mr. Kelly made some omissions because he's in that state of fear and agitation and adrenaline and excitement, that's being held against him. And that shouldn't be held against him. That should be held against the officers who didn't properly recognize the situation, who didn't ask questions of witnesses. You heard the state argue this was an emergency call, lights and sirens, active shooter. Law enforcement was on high alert when they came to the scene. They had their rifles out. And yet they failed to recognize that Mr. and Mrs. Kelly might be in a state of emotional agitation, to put it mildly. They don't recognize that. They don't do a slow walk through of the information. They don't take their time. They don't even go do another search. And now we are left with questions. We do not know if Gabriel Quinn Butimea's body was there when law enforcement arrived. It's a question that's outstanding. We don't know the answer to it, and now we never will. Ultimately, law enforcement leaves, and later in the evening, Alan finds this body on his property. This is the second time this day that things have gone from normal and regular to high anxiety, high stress, extreme situation happening here. I've never discovered a dead body on my property. You folks probably haven't either. But who's to say how any of us is going to react when we come upon something like that? How are we supposed to feel? What are we supposed to think? What is an appropriate response to finding a dead person on your property? And imagine what must be going through this man's head. He knows what happened earlier. He knows what he saw. He knows what he did. He knows he fired shots up over the tree in front of his patio, and now he's stumbling upon a person. And he doesn't know what happened. He's a smart man, and he can put two and two together. And any intelligent person who's in his situation, imagine being in a situation where you fired shots and you know you didn't shoot this person, but you know you fired shots. That is scary. Anybody in Alan's shoes is going to be thinking, oh my Lord, What are they going to think when I call this in? It's a terrifying scenario for Alan. What would a guilty person do? What would someone do who's come across this body and who thinks, I probably shot this guy? What would a guilty person do in Alan's shoes? Someone with a huge, expansive property, someone who knows law enforcement was already here and they left, someone who knows that's where I was standing when I fired these shots. A guilty person had every opportunity to cover this up, and he would have been able to do so effectively. He could have disposed of the weapon. He could have picked up the shell casings. He even could have disposed of the body on this property. He didn't even need to do that. He could have just picked up the weapon, hid it, buried it somewhere, buried the shell casings somewhere, and never made a phone call and just left on a trip for a while. That's all he had to do. That's all a guilty person had to do. That's not what Alan did. Alan, even though he's standing there and even though he knows this looks bad, I don't know what's going to happen, he does the right thing. He does the right thing because it's the right thing. You can tell when he's having these phone calls. In the state, they pull up some excerpts and they read them in their tone of voice. I encourage you to review these phone calls and listen to Alan's tone of voice. Listen to his demeanor, hear what he's saying. Is this a person who knows that he's guilty and is trying to cover things up, but nevertheless is calling law enforcement, which is what the state wants you to think? Or is this a person who is completely scared and shell-shocked because he knows he didn't do this, but he knows that calling it in is the right thing to do? And he trusts that law enforcement is going to do the right thing. He trusts that they are going to listen to him. And so he calls it in. He calls the Border Patrol, the guy with the badge and the gun, the guy who he called earlier, the same guy who sent all the deputies out earlier and who sent Border Patrol out earlier. There's no possibility that Alan thinks the Border Patrol is going to sweep this under the rug. No possibility whatsoever that he thinks that. He's still in a distraught state. He still doesn't know how he feels. He's still communicating in a vague way to Agent Morcell because he is in shock. What's the appropriate response when you find a dead body on your property? Can anyone say, here's how you're supposed to act, and if you act differently, then that's wrong? People act in all sorts of ways when confronted with shocking and frightening scenarios. And Alan couldn't form the words. He called for help and he tried. He tried to communicate what he was finding, and he did. You cannot listen to these phone calls with, well, there aren't phone calls recorded with Border Patrol, unfortunately. You can't listen to the phone call that Alan has with the Sheriff's Department and conclude that he's not communicating that there is a dead body on his property. He makes it very clear with the words that he can call to mind in that moment, which is a terrible moment for Mr. Kelly. There's a lot made about the phrase animal, or the use of the word animal. Agent Morcell testified that he used that word first. He asked Mr. Kelly, "What is it, Mr. Kelly? You're not telling me what's going on. Is there an animal?" And Mr. Kelly responded to him and said, "Well, as opposed to a vegetable or a mineral, if you know what I mean." He's clear. He's making himself clear. And then he does the same thing when he's on the phone call with the Sheriff's Department. Something that else goes to Mr. Kelly's mind when he's talking with the Sheriff's Department is the Sheriff's Department dispatcher tells him, "You said you shot something." The dispatcher tells that to Mr. Kelly when he has never said anything like that. Again, imagine How must somebody feel knowing I fired shots earlier, I know I didn't hit this person, here's a dead body, oh, I'm afraid to call this in, but I have to call it in. And then when dispatch talks to him, dispatch says, you said you shot something. That is terrifying. That is a terrifying mistake that dispatch made, and it's terrifying for Alan to hear that. That's all in his mind when law enforcement is responding to his property. That's also all in the minds of all of the law enforcement personnel who are going to this property. They are being told incorrectly that Alan stated he struck something or he shot something when Alan never made that statement. And it's nobody's fault. Alan's on the phone with Agent Morcell. Agent Morcell is on the phone with Agent Tercy. Agent Tercy is relaying that to Agent Layugan. Agent Layugan is relaying that out to the Sheriff's Department. So you have all of these layers of telephone. And of course, things get lost in translation. It's not necessarily anybody's fault, but it is a crucial defining factor in this case. The investigators go out there already believing that this guy has confessed. They already have their suspect before they arrive at the scene. When they're at the scene, Lopez, the first person who comes out, he talks to Alan. He finally records a conversation. And his recording shows that his report was wrong. This is a theme that comes up repeatedly in this case. Law enforcement documents statements, especially Alan's statements, especially Wanda's statements, incorrectly. We have two reports from the first call from two different officers who both at the same time talked to Mrs. Kelly. And they both say that she said two completely different things. None of these conversations are recorded. Documentation is unreliable. The conversations between Mr. Kelly and Agent Morcell, not recorded, unreliable documentation. Finally, when we have a recording, it's Lopez, first person on the scene. He records him. And Lopez documents that conversation incorrectly in his report as well. According to Lopez's report, he says to Mr. Kelly, "Do you know if you shot him?" And Mr. Kelly says, "I have no idea." That sounds pretty bad. Sounds like Mr. Kelly's admitting he might have shot this person. That is not what Mr. Kelly said. When you listen to Lopez's recording, the recording says, "Do you know who shot him?" And Mr. Kelly says, "I have no idea." Very, very different. The documentation of the statements made in this case is really concerning to anybody who's worried about law enforcement being objective. You have Omar Rodriguez, who gets out and stands near the body. He's looking at the body. He's got this in his mind, and he speculates about the angle of the shot, the same way that you heard the state speculate in their argument to you about the angle of the shot. He says this shot comes in here, goes out here, there's the house over there, aha! The shot must have come from there. That's not what any of the experts say. The experts say you have no idea, based on this evidence, where this shot came from. We're going to get to them in a minute. But the initial investigators feel very free to speculate. You have Sergeant Flores, who takes photographs of the body. There's no note that the backpack is unzipped. Nobody raises that as an issue in any reports. Nobody raises the issue about how the backpack's pulled up over this person's head. Nobody raises the issue about how the fanny pack buckle is broken and the fanny pack is lying next to this person. There are photographs, we can see those things, but nobody seemed concerned about that. Nobody seemed to think maybe there are other crimes that have taken place here besides the obvious crime of this person's been shot. Nobody ever considered that there was any other evidence of any other crimes. Sergeant Flores on the stand specifically said, "No, I didn't see any evidence of any crime. None." Amazing. It's amazing. think more about the emotional aspect of this. These are human beings. Alan's a human being, Wanda's a human being. We're not robots. We all react differently in different situations. Alan's on scene. Nobody's talked to him. Still, nobody's asked him, walk me through what happened. Show me where you were. Nobody does that. And then they put handcuffs on him. And they put him into a police car. Imagine what he must be thinking in that moment. Imagine just that feeling of, oh my gosh, this is really real now. They're taking me away in handcuffs from my house. I don't know if I'm coming back. That's an unbelievable moment for anybody to have to go through. Imagine Wanda. She's been sitting in the back of a police car. They don't ask her what happened. They don't walk her through the scene. They don't ask her anything. They put her in the back of a police car. Wanda, a person who has obviously never done anything wrong, who's obviously the victim of a crime. They put her in a police car. They take her to the station. That's an arrest. They arrest Wanda. They don't have any reason to do that. And right before they drive away with her, she sees her husband walking past the car in handcuffs. How does she feel when she's being taken to this interview? How does Alan feel when he's being taken to this interview? Would it be reasonable to be scared? Of course it would be. Would it be reasonable to be really concerned now? Maybe I don't really trust these investigators. I'm in handcuffs when I called them. That's a big concern. This is what's going on emotionally when Alan and Wanda are interviewed by law enforcement. And again, there's no slow walkthrough. There's no show me on a map where this is. What did you do? Describe this to me. Wait, let me back you up a little bit. Tell me more about this. They don't do any of that. There's browbeating. There's tactics used to try to scare this man into confessing. Detective Einsa tells him, you shot this person. That's pretty scary, especially if you know you didn't shoot this person. There's, we're gonna find that rifle and we're gonna do ballistics. By the way, what's Alan's response to that? He says, you don't need a search warrant. I will show you where the rifle is. I will show you where the rifle is. This rifle that's supposedly not in its proper place, according to these guys. Alan says, I will show you where this rifle is. Detective Einsa says, no. Fair enough, okay? Then we get to significant issues of words being changed. And this starts with Alan. He's in this interview with Detective Einsa, and watch it. Don't pick out a line here or there. Watch it. You have the whole interview. Look at the whole thing beginning to end. Listen to the context. Listen to the tone of voice, the body language. It's a whole. Don't pick out a line and decide what it says. Watch it. Repeatedly, Detective Einsa says, you shot this person. You shot at these people. Alan says, no, I never did that. The state talked about a part in that interview where he was asked, did you shoot? And he doesn't answer. Watch the interview. Detective Barba asks him, did you shoot? Alan pauses, and then Detective Einsa jumps in with a different question, and Alan answers that question. He never denies having shot his rifle, ever. He's asked, he says, yes, I shot this rifle. I shot it up. I shot it over. Detective Einsa says, at, over, same thing. Alan says, no, it's not the same thing. It's a different thing. And there's back and forth about that a lot. Alan obviously thinks at and over are two different things. Alan also repeatedly says, I never chased anybody. I never went after anybody. I don't know where you're getting that. Watch the interview. It's there. In spite of this, law enforcement essentially fabricates a confession. They write down on the booking form. That booking form is their statement of probable cause. Here's what happened. Subject, he was chasing people. He shot. He admitted he shot at multiple subjects. That was not true. Alan never said that. Law enforcement wasn't listening, and they didn't care. They already decided that he was guilty, and they were perfectly fine inventing words for him. Words that were the opposite of what he said and putting those down as if he said them. There's a lot made about Wanda. The treatment of Wanda in this case was just disgraceful. They're trying to say that she's lying to protect her husband. She said 5 and then she said 2. They come up with these extremely nitpicked, not recorded, supposed inconsistent statements to say that she's lying. I would just submit to you that if Wanda were lying about what happened in this case, all she would have to do would be to say, I saw these guys, he pointed a rifle at my husband. That's all she would have to say. She didn't say that because she didn't see. But if she wanted to lie about something to protect Alan, very easy for her to do. That's all she would have to say, and nobody could contradict her. She didn't do it. So, confirmation bias is a big thing that runs through this case, and it's the tendency to interpret new information and new evidence to confirm pre-existing beliefs and conclusions, and that plays a very big role in this case too. They do this interview with Alan, they don't listen to the words he says, they make up new words, and they arrest him. They don't wait until they can do ballistics. They don't wait until maybe they can find some witnesses. They don't wait until they can do forensic testing or any drone footage or anything. They don't wait. They just go straight for this guy. And every single thing that they do after that, they design to confirm the decision that they've already made. It's natural. Human beings, we like to confirm that we're right. It's really uncomfortable to say I might have made a mistake, maybe I was wrong. And so when they get a phone call from somebody calling himself Miguel, who says he's related to the family, they don't question it. And then when it turns out that that's false, well, oh well. They're not concerned that people are coming forward making false statements about this case, even though apparently they've talked about it, I don't know. But it doesn't bother them. Then there's this person, Ramon, and he says something different. He comes forward under different circumstances too. Does anybody bother to analyze his statements? Does anybody bother to compare his statements against Miguel's statements or Mr. Kelly's statements? Does anybody bother to compare Ramon's statements to the physical evidence in this case? No, of course not. They don't need to. They have their guy. They have their conclusion. Then we get to Daniel. The state says he makes consistent statements. And remember, if you're inconsistent, that means you might be lying about something. Well, Daniel doesn't even tell investigators what his name is in this case. He comes forward under very suspicious circumstances. He comes forward after this has all been out, after they know that Mr. Kelly's been arrested. His picture's been all over the place. Their version of events is out there for anyone to read, for anybody to think about, for anybody to make something up about. And here comes Daniel. And he lies about his name because he doesn't want to get deported back to Honduras. And he lies about his criminal history. He's asked, have you ever smuggled drugs in the United States? He says no. That is not true. He's telling a lie. The state says he's not associated with any criminal organization. He's not a drug smuggler. Daniel says, I'm not a drug smuggler. Well, except for when he is, because he took a plea in federal court under oath to smuggling drugs. Lied about his name to federal court also, by the way. You hear from law enforcement that you can't just accept a statement as the truth just because it's a statement. You have to test its credibility. You have to see if it matches up with other statements, with physical evidence, with known facts of the case, with forensic evidence. And that's how you can assess the reliability of a witness statement. I'm not going to get the whiteboard out again. You guys have seen me do it already, but you've got a body found 115 yards east of Mr. Kelly's house. You've got that body lying face down. You've got Daniel stating, we were 10 meters away from the house. We were to the west of the house. We were facing the border wall. Border wall is 2 football fields away. The shots were coming from over there, away from the house. That is impossible to believe. It could not have happened that way. We know for a fact, we're not guessing, we know for a fact that it did not happen the way that Daniel said that it happened. We know for a fact that Daniel previously told investigators he was 15 meters away from the border wall when this happened. We know that for a fact. State says he's consistent. How is that consistent? It's not. We know for a fact that Daniel claims he gets right up to that road that goes by the border wall where the pines are. I look back, I saw the person. We know that for a fact. We know that that is impossible. You all have been out there. You know what the end of the wall looks like. You know what this road looks like. That is impossible. We are not guessing about that. That is a fact. We know that the body's not on the west side of the house. Fact. We know that the body is not 10 yards away from the house. Fact. We know that there is no Border Patrol road that goes through this property that goes directly to the end of the wall, like Daniel said it did. Fact. We know he is wrong. What does that mean? It means he wasn't there. It means he is telling a story. Why? We don't know. But you can't be there and get it this wrong. It is not possible. I don't care if you have a 6th grade education. My kid has a 3rd grade education, and she can describe a place. It's not that hard. Nobody questions this either. Forget what Daniel says for a minute and how obviously false and concerning that is. What is wrong with the investigators in this case? Raul Rodriguez interviews Daniel, and he says things that Raul Rodriguez, Detective Rodriguez, admits these are not making sense. Instead of pursuing that, for example, he says this took place west of Nogales. No, it didn't. We know that for a fact. It took place east of Nogales. Instead of pursuing that as a possible problem, as a possible, maybe this person's not so credible, maybe they have another motive for coming forward, law enforcement doesn't bother asking any questions. Instead, they provide explanations. They provide help. They provide suggestion. They say, well, are you sure you were that close? That sounds pretty close. Are you sure? Well, maybe you don't know because you were running and maybe you were scared and so you didn't really know where you were, right? They make suggestive statements to this witness in an interview when really they should be suspicious about this and they should do some detective work to find out what the truth is. Not to bolster what they've already decided they want the truth to be. That's not how an investigation should work. And let's remember, Daniel first comes forward because the sheriff goes into Why is the sheriff going into Mexico? Why? He doesn't wear a uniform because if you wear your uniform in Mexico, they get picky about that. That's what he said. It's quite the euphemism. And then they don't record this interview, and then they record part of it, and they've got no good reason for why they did that. That is sketchy. And that sets the tone for this whole investigation. So that's some of the facts, that's some of the evidence that you've heard from this witness. Let's talk about the forensics. The medical examiner's report essentially says there's no way to determine the time of death. This is a very significant fact in this case. What was the time of death? Because if his body wasn't there when the sheriff's department searched this area, then Alan has nothing to do with this. We have evidence that Omar Rodriguez examined the body. He says the torso is still warm. This is significant information. He could have passed that on to a medical examiner to get some sort of scientific determination of time of death. Didn't do that. They put the body in a cooler. They destroy any possibility of accurately determining a time of death scientifically. And the medical examiner's report proves that a gunshot wound is the cause of death. It doesn't prove which gun, doesn't prove which type of gun, doesn't prove which type of ammunition, doesn't prove even long gun or handgun, doesn't prove anything other than gunshot wound. Okay, great. The ballistics. Let's talk about that. See what can be proved in this case, what they did prove forensically. They talk about this as a long-range shot. I recall the ballistics experts testifying that what that means is this shot was fired from a distance of 6 feet away or further. That's a long-range shot. So they've proven that this shot was taken from 6 feet away or further. Anything in between is a guess, and we are not supposed to guess. The ballistics, obviously there's no bullet, so they can't prove which weapon this came from. They can't prove which type of weapon this came from. They can't prove, again, which type of ammunition this came from. The shell casings, we heard testimony about shell casings that are found on the patio. They can't prove which direction the shooter was pointing. You make a circle around the shell casing. The shooter could be standing anywhere in that circle. They can't prove if the shooter was pointing straight or up or something else. Interestingly, the ballistics experts testified that had they known, had they been told that there was a possibility that this rifle was shot in an upward direction, they could have done testing on the shell casing pattern. And they might have been able to come to a conclusion about that. Yes, it was pointing up, or no, or it's inconclusive. But they didn't do the test because they were never asked to by the state. The investigators in this case never tested their own theory. They never considered that what Alan said might actually be supported by some evidence, and maybe we should look for that evidence too, not just evidence that shows that he's guilty. They didn't do that. And now we'll never know. Imagine if this were a sexual assault case and there was DNA of the perpetrator involved. And the investigators said, well, we could test that DNA, but it'll probably be inconclusive, so we're not going to test it. That's outrageous. That is outrageous. We have a right to expect that people who are investigating people for serious crimes are going to examine and test every piece of evidence that they can, even if it might not tell them something. What if it could? What if they did that test? What if it showed that an expert could say this rifle was pointed in an upward direction? It could do that. We would want to know that, wouldn't we? Before we decide what happened in this case. They didn't do it. The ballistics also, you've got this field of obstacles in between the porch and where this body is eventually located. You've seen the photographs, you've been to the scene, you know how many things are in between there. What I didn't hear the state address is the problem of the point of aim and the point of impact for this rifle. I'm not going to rehash all of that, but ballistics experts said that if that entry wound, and this is assuming the person's just standing there, we have no idea where this person was when he was shot. The ballistics experts testified that they could not possibly determine that. based on the evidence that they saw. But the point of impact on this person was about 4 feet off the ground, which according to the experts means Allen would have to been aiming, if he took the shot, at a spot that's about 3 feet off the ground, which means he's aiming down. And you saw everything that was in the way. You saw the smoker, the pergola, the patio, the table and the chairs that's on there that's made out of cement. If he were firing in that manner, there would be evidence. The fact that there's no evidence of any bullet impacting anything in that entire field is evidence that supports what Allen said happened. If he fired where he said he fired, of course you don't expect to see bullet evidence in that field of obstacles, and you don't. The physical ballistics evidence is consistent with what Mr. Kelly said happened in this case.
Ms. Larkin?
Yes.
It's about 5 to noon. I think it's appropriate. It looks like you're moving into a new area, so it's a good time to break. We'll take our noon recess. Same routine as we've been following all week long. We'll take a noon recess and go out to lunch. Please be back in the jury room at 1:30, at which time the defense will continue with its closing argument. We're in recess until 1:30 in the afternoon.